let's welcome Nathan. And
thanks.
I should also say there's someone here in the crowd that I didn't expect.
Yeah.
Micah Perlin.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not a political event,
Right.
But he has a connection with Nathan, and he is, well, he'll probably say some words at some point during this presentation.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. And in bringing Micah here, we're starting kind of a video series where we're discussing different topics that are based on climate restoration, climate remediation, and how that affects policy. So that was an opportunity to bring Micah here today, running for the 78th district at the state level for assembly. So without further delay, I'm going to get started. Yes, Nathan White, CEO and co-founder of Ages Inc. We started our company about 7.5 years ago, looking at ways to effectively implement project management skills. There's a lot of misuse of funds at the government level, all the way down to the project level. So projects can be very expensive when it comes to administration. We want to try and cut through some of that and get projects implemented quickly for a low cost. And so today we're going to be talking about some of our efforts, the restoration project at Laguna Salada and the Salton Sea. Part of that is talking about the regional solutions to climate emergencies. So there's ways that we could do templates that are regional in scale and even local at scale that are a template for restoration at a global level once we kind of expand. So I'm going to run through this as kind of a very small scale, local scale examples, and then we're going to kind of ramp up to this larger scale regional effort that is binational. We have Laguna Salada here in the middle, the northern Sea of Cortez, or the Gulf of California to the right, and then we have the Salton Sea. So this is kind of rotated sideways, but this is the north direction here. We've been working on projects for about 7 years in the Salton Sea, but my background is a bachelor's in architecture and a master's in architecture and real estate development. That took me about 10 years to get through schooling. For the past 6 years, I've worked as a professional project manager with the City of San Diego Development Services Department. So doing grading, public improvements, completeness check for discretionary permits, final maps, tentative maps, all of the very complex rezones and plan amendment permits with the city here. But it's given me an opportunity to, at night when I'm not taking care of my kids, to be able to work on these kind of environmental restoration efforts that are pretty large scale. But we have very local examples of those. So just going through those, we're going to first talk about policy, fossil fuel subsidies, fossil fuel legislation, and transition to renewables. That's a big topic in our subsidies and our government funding going towards private corporations and the advantage that that gives those companies in being able to be competitive in a general market. Then we're going to go down the list: alternative energy, industrial partners, micro developments, larger scale restoration, and then global expansion. Alternative generating energies and sustainable solutions is kind of our acronym for AGES. We're a professional project management team for a better environment. So you can kind of see what's happening at the global scale in Brazil, other places around the world. We're still issuing permits. The tar sands oil fields in Canada, we're moving through those permits and expanding that operation, when in fact what we really need to do, and I presented last time I was here about 4 years ago, is we really need to get back to pre-industrial emission levels. We need to sequester a lot of carbon in the atmosphere to balance out the ecosystem and create an environment that can sustain habitats again, rather than clear-cutting mountains, digging, and refining oil. There's a more environmentally sensitive way to do that. So we're looking at the race for renewable domination and how much money goes towards renewable energy across the different countries. We're down about $1 billion compared to China, so hopefully we can pick up that steam and get more renewables in the market. We have about 4 times less subsidies going towards renewables than we do oil production. So hopefully over the next few years that will switch. If we went from $440 billion in the renewables section and an environmental restoration section, we can get projects off the ground much quicker. Some estimates were, I think, $400 billion to like really fix the climate emergency that we see. So if we just switched 1 year of subsidies over to that side, we might see a dramatic difference. So first, we're going to talk about alternative energy. That's the root of our company. We've always looked at alternative energy generating resources and systems. So as you might know, Palm Springs in the history, that's where it came from. It had small subsidies, it had small grants to get wind off the ground. Now you see wind fields taking over most of that valley. This is where I grew up in Cathedral City. Beautiful actually to go see the wind farms that are out in Palm Springs. And basically, we're going to go into the systems of how they determined that was the ideal location for wind farms. And that's how we're coming up with our proposal for restoration of Laguna Salada. You can see alternatives. This is a rendering that I created, which is basically being able to put solar, wind, and hydro barrel generators over a river stretch of a dredge canal. So you have 3 times the energy generation systems, plus you're creating shade for the water. So you have a 4 times benefit to a traditional solar array or wind array. You can couple those type of energies. And you see over there in China, they're doing these at scale. It actually creates twice as much efficiency when you put a solar panel over water. So you're getting 2 solar panels for the price of 1. That's a really interesting topic. I mean, just from my interest, this could be happening in Lake Hodges and some of our reservoirs where we really want to reserve our resources. You can create twice as much energy and reduce evaporation, which takes a lot of energy to move water around the state. About 20% of our energy is just in moving water. Again, Lucid Energy is a company that we might work with. They're willing to donate their equipment if we want to get a power purchase agreement. They can use these inline pipe energy generation systems that are used in Oregon. You put them in line with a pipe and it starts to generate energy. These corkscrew turbines, water wheels, these little turbines are really interesting when you have a river system that you've created, and then you can splinter off and start creating alternative energy every distance along that pipeline or open river. Some of our industrial partners, from a systems-based approach, this to me is most interesting. Ned Doherty of H2O Futures presented with us last time. We kind of had a board that presented his particular systems. But to me, he was at my final presentation when I was graduating school. I was fascinated by seawater farming. Is anybody familiar with a seawater farm? Right? It's not a widely known topic that you can use untreated seawater to grow food and biofuel. And you can also create building products and ecosystems. So you can kind of see these diagrams to the right. They were used in Eritrea, where they use untreated seawater for fish and tilapia and bivalves. And then that creates the nutrient-rich water that you use for your agricultural plants. And those plants can be used for biofuel and biojet fuel. And the real interesting part about that is that it burns twice as clean as traditional. So when we're talking about this really large regional transition away from fossil fuels, you can transition easily into biofuels to burn cleaner. So you're emitting half as much into the atmosphere just by a system like this. And you're sequestering a lot of carbon into the soil, right? So it's very interesting when you think about this nexus, and you have a habitat at the end of the day. So we'll get into this more as it scales up to our discussion. Some floating island systems. These create a lot of nutrient uptake. And this is kind of where we founded our company. We were trying to use algae to pull nutrients out of the water, like Mission Bay or San Diego Bay. They're very nutrient polluted. So rather than using algae systems to pull it out, you can use these islands that create habitat, but also shade the water so you don't have as much evaporation, and you're pulling nutrients out. Another partner that we have, they do phytoremediation. Is anybody familiar with that? It's a very complex thing, but it's plants pulling out heavy metals, right? So you can use plants in selective locations and selective species, a lot of which are California natives, and it can extract heavy metals and pollution and nutrients at the same time that you're taking away things like selenium. Very interesting, selenium is a big issue at the Salton Sea. You can actually extract it using plants, create an organic fertilizer, and sell it to places that are selenium depleted, like China. They have selenium depletion in their agricultural production, so that's a way to create a revenue stream. They work with NASA, a lot of their systems are going to be on Mars and the moon one day, but he's a really nice guy that really wants and is passionate about cleaning up oil spills and mine spills, and he does that for the federal government right now. So we talk about them as industrial partners. When we get small projects and large projects, they're able to integrate their technology. So just quickly on some of our micro developments, we'll get into more of the design. This is a project for Cesar Chavez Park that we proposed, where it's seawater farming, education and tourism, and just an overall demonstration of all of these larger systems. Hello. So you can kind of see what would be a little seawater garden. It has bike parking. It has, the agricultural pond or the aquaculture ponds that lead to the agriculture fields. And really it could be edible, but you would just make fertilizer, or you'd make waste and give that material away rather than trying to give it to people for human consumption. Obviously the permits are a lot more complicated, but the seawater farming and seawater grass in and of itself could be demonstrated at a place like Cesar Chavez Park. There's a lot of plants that can use seawater, and it's really interesting for Mission Bay Park. We spend about $1 million in watering grass. If we just transitioned away from that and started watering it with seawater tolerant grass, we could save a lot of money and a lot of energy because we're not piping fresh water all the way around San Diego to end up on the dirt. You can pump it right out of Mission Bay and put it into use in a seawater farm or seawater grass. So just quickly, some little education demonstration ideas about how to get kids out in that area. The port didn't really like the idea of having boats in the bay, so I'd have to redesign that in this specific location. So getting to Salton Sea related projects. This is Salton City Keys. There's areas that are receding from the Salton Sea. This used to be full of water here in this area. All of these houses had waterfronts up to them, but now the Salton Sea's receded about 10 feet. So we're looking at those keys drying out and it causing really bad respiratory issues. So our proposal, looking at this one at a community scale, is really creating berm systems. You can kind of see a 3 stack of berms here, 2 stack there, 2 stack there, and then just dirt around the edges that create water that you're pumping in from the Salton Sea into these keys. You can use water wells to blend it with fresher water to create habitat. This project is Desert Shores, and we've been working on this for almost 3 years. And it seems like a long time, and it's still in this condition. Unfortunately, we have an MOU that's been drafted by Imperial County, Air Pollution Control District, sent to the California Natural Resources Agency, and it's still in that process of trying to get water into these boat keys. This is the simplest project the state could have on their boards, but basically to put a berm in here and pump water in from the Salton Sea solves a lot of their issues. So it's still in process. I'm hopefully going to be completed by the end of this year. But this is the project that we've been working on for a long time, and this is the Desert Shores community. They have about 240 homes here. The thought and the logic is that you can create a lot of habitat, but you have 240 lots that can create a value of maybe $100 or $1,000 a piece, and that can generate almost $240,000 in value. The cost of this berm and the pump is about $200,000. Sir, please, yeah.
So, I mean, as a scientist, years go by and research all the time, but I was just curious in your work, water, I saw on one of your YouTubes quite a back and forth with illustrate to me that there's moments, there's challenges. I would want to say at some point what some of your common challenges are leading up to the 3 years, whether it's the communities, interest groups, the technology itself scaling up.
Yeah, it's a big part of wanting to get the state on board, right? Getting the state of California to do anything is going to be a monumental task. We were initiating permits and trying to do that ourselves, but it is cost prohibitive. To get permits on something like this is in the range of $50,000, $60,000. So we went through the process of asking for a fee waiver from the county, which they approved, But still, through that process, we have to hire civil engineers, we have to hire structural engineers, we have to go through that process. So it was cost prohibitive at that point to continue with our permits, although all I need is a civil engineer and I can get that berm built. So that might be my direction, that I self-finance it, or we get funding mechanisms to actually build the berm, not specifically the array that's going to be $60,000 for solar energy. We already have a boat, we already have a pump. So the biggest challenge, to get to the root of your question, is to try and have the state adopt a policy to get water in an area like this. So I've been working very closely with the county to see if they can open up. When you mentioned they declared a state of emergency, their response was that we are not going to declare a state of emergency. This happened just recently when we were having fires, right? There was 2 or 3 fires that occurred on the week that they declared an emergency for the Salton Sea. That's unfortunate, but it still is an emergency. But my suggestion to the county is open up a funding mechanism and request from the state funds to put into an open solicitation, RFPs, RFQs, that can give the people on the ground an opportunity to apply, where you don't have to go to the state. The state is working with the county and individuals are working with the county. So it decentralizes us trying to work directly with the state. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. So hopefully this thing is off the ground and the county is working with the state, and we're going to get built this year. Then we can work on phase 2. Beautiful architecture, opportunities for the community, a piece that is, kind of harks back to Palm Springs modernism with a environmental touch to it. So this is the designs that I kind of created, and we'll just kind of go, if we can, let's see. Oh, it doesn't let me go into the video. It's okay. There's a video on our YouTube channel that kind of flies through all of this, and it'll share some of what it looks like from a different perspective, but really a way that we can reference down to a single point, and these can radiate off of this area. This would be an education center for kids to come to. So all this being said, we have industrial developments that are happening right now. The real interesting part of why everybody's here today. And it took all of that information to be able to say and project what these larger scale projects will encompass. So the Salton Sea, it's a natural depression about 280 feet below sea level, formed in 1904 with a flood when the Colorado River broke. You have eutrophication, large area, lots of evaporation. This is the state's plan for the Salton Sea. And as you might see, there's a lot of dust and a lot of empty space in the middle. But this is what they can propose with current water flowing into the Salton Sea from the New River, the Alamo River, and the Whitewater River. So you have 3 water bodies coming into there. This is what they can sustain as far as habitat and water flow. And that being said, it's going to be a very costly system to construct. Water flow was constricted with the QSA that transferred a lot of their water rights here to San Diego. So we're the beneficiary of the Salton Sea drying up, unfortunately, but there's an opportunity. Loss of habitat and reduction of this. So we're just looking at the numbers, and I could share this with anybody that's interested, but the numbers are pretty dire when it comes to exposed playa. Playa has very fine particles that cause cancer when they're inhaled. And when the water dries out, that dry lake bed will be picked up, and the dust will be picked up by very heavy windstorms that happen naturally in the area. So this could be devastating for San Diego, LA, Mexicali, and most of Southern California and Arizona. This is a very expensive way to build the berm. Go ahead, sir. Yeah.
On that graphic that you provided there, is that central area, is that like planned to be like dry area? I'm not sure what I'm looking at.
Yeah, so they would build a levee system.
The whole center of the lake is going to be somehow like filled in? I'm not sure.
No, eventually it's just allowed to go dry.
But somehow along the shore is going to be water?
Yeah, so what they're proposing is called a perimeter lake. And the perimeter lake allows for the inflow of water, the 2 resources coming in here. If you've heard of the Alamo and the New River, a lot of nutrient pollution that crosses the US-Mexico border. Those go in, a lot of the ag runoff come in from the south. Whitewater to the north brings a lot of ag water as well as river flow water in storm events. Please?
All right, so again, so that I understand what I'm looking at there. So the designated blue area is where water is going to be. What is the proposed elevation of what that blue area is?
Right, the high point that we have there is negative 243 on this inside marker. The outside marker is negative 235, I believe. So it's about 30 feet of depth on the deepest portion.
Okay.
Which, again, when we go to this section, it becomes very expensive when you have to retain. The bigger logic that we started taking with this whole proposal is this is very expensive just for a North Lake, which is just a small portion of this top part. If you just look at that top little ring, that's the North Lake proposal, $400 million, right? Just for those little marks that go off to the side, just that little portion. If I can use my cursor up here, I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, so the North Lake is basically here cut off and then across here cut off. That's $400 million for building that berm levee system. To me, doesn't make sense, right? From a cost-benefit analysis, you have too little for too much. Takes too long, very expensive to build, and the environmental impact is catastrophic when you have to quarry rocks, transport those rocks, dump them into a system that might fail if you have an earthquake. So that became our logical thinking. Why are we going to let the state build something that's going to cost us, the taxpayers, money and is not very cost effective? So you can see the state's plan. Hopefully not the state's plan if you're listening, Arturo. We're going to be resubmitting a little background history on the process. I submitted to the long range planning group 2 different occasions to bring about the request for an RFI, RFP, RFQ. If you're not familiar, request for information, request for proposals, request for qualifications. They released an RFI for seawater import from the Sea of Cortez or Pacific Ocean, just water import to the Salton Sea. We submitted our proposal to that RFI, that response. They went through and identified a couple of things that were missing on our proposal. So over the last few years, we're working on rectifying and completing that information. And we just met with Arturo Delgado, who's the Secretary of Salton Sea Policy with the state. And we're going to be resubmitting in the next few months with additional information. So that's kind of the backstory of us requesting these things to happen, and that RFI, whether it's from my lobbying or from other people, the community lobbying, to actually have an open proposal process to listen to the viability of seawater import. So you have option A, very dusty, very dry, and our thought is it might have a catastrophic effect on the Colorado River Delta system itself. We hope not, but that's what we want to study. If you let the Salton Sea go dry, all of the evaporation that happens down here in the Sea of Cortez as well as the Salton Sea, that might have a negative effect on the monsoons that go through to Arizona and New Mexico. So that's our proposal. What we're going to want to look at is a global climate model to study this option A to the left and our option B to the right. Funny enough, this is a historical image from Google Earth that shows Laguna Salada flooded, and that happened about the time I was born in 1984. It was fully flooded with excess water from the Delta. So you can see the effect of water has on the southern southwest area of the United States. This is a massive connectivity issue when it comes to monsoons, created down here in this region when it's hot, and it blows that water into the Colorado Rockies and the Colorado River Delta system. So looking through time, this is kind of a history, and that little margin to the right up here is kind of showing these high points over time. It seems to be a correlation between when this was flooded and when we had a lot of excess water in the Colorado River Delta system. So that's what we want to find out, see if there's a corollary and a direct benefit to it. What we have here, kind of going through the science of it, we have a lot of wind coming from the Pacific Ocean over Laguna Salada in Mexico. We have a lot of wind blowing from west to east. You can kind of see some of these layers here, some of these wind patterns that we have. And that water that's really hot here in the northern tip creates those monsoonal events. Some of the water uptake, evaporation occurs all the way through here, and we hope that could be reinforced when we restore that area. So this is, again, some weather cycles, weather patterns that we've looked at over time. That could happen in different areas, as you can see here. That can happen in sometimes over this area, but other times it happens directly from the Gulf in other locations. That's, again, that high peak that we looked at where we see excess water in the Colorado River Delta as it might relate to the times in which Laguna Salada was flooded. Some of those other patterns, more science and data that we've provided to the state of California about rainfall as it relates to the time of year. And warm season, cold season, different things like that, option A and option B. We hope that this isn't the norm if the state moves forward with their plan, or even the trajectory of the next 20 or 30 years of water drying and that monsoon event being negatively affected. Or what, did anybody hear about the non-soon that happened a year or two ago, where there was no monsoon in the season? Hopefully that doesn't become the norm, because that has a negative effect on the whole delta. So large scale, and I'm going to go through these in different sections. We're basically going to start with phase 1, which is down here. Then we have that being able to flood Laguna Salada. Phase 2, bringing water around. Phase 3 is structures within the Salton Sea to take care of some of those salt accumulation issues. And then we're going to kind of scale it back a little bit. So this is the affected area that we propose would have more evaporation when you flood Laguna Salada and keep water in these areas. A lot of this is just data over time that we accumulated. There is a water conveyance system, which is the Coyote Canal. This is existing, that was built back in the 80s to bring water and flood this region. So you can kind of see some of that creating the opportunity. This is the high tide events. So that whole massive area, if we go back real quick, this entire area down here, once a month floods with tidal flow. So that whole region to the bottom right floods, flushes back down into the Sea of Cortez. So our thought is that we can reinforce that system, widen, deepen the Coyote Canal, and encourage water to flow into Laguna Salada on a regular basis, create a retention berm that keeps it from flowing back out. Strategically, of course, to protect the environment and be self-sufficient. So you can kind of see some of those deltas. And we had an earthquake that kind of created more subsidence, created more flooding areas, but helped a project proposal like this. Sir?
Is the Coyote Canal that you said is man-made?
Mm-hmm.
Serendipitous, fortunate, as that your project can take advantage of, or what was it built for?
It was built for that purpose. It was actually directing Colorado River water down back into Laguna Salada. So all that water that came down through the... Well, and it was flooding retention, water retention, right? So it's kind of a part and parcel of the opportunity for fishing and habitat, but also for preserving some of that freshwater flow. Because as most people know, we're not meeting our obligations of delivering water to Mexico per our treaty that delivered a certain amount. So in events like that where they had an overflow, they were going to take advantage and keep as much fresh water as they could. So that is kind of the context of the Coyote Canal. But it is serendipitous that as sea level rise, that is going to be a conveyance system that we're going to hopefully expand upon. You can kind of see the need of what we would call a check dam, which would be a retention dam that would keep water that flushes in to flow back down into the Laguna Salada. So it's it seems like a small berm, but it's actually pretty large. But it's a way for all of this flooded area to come back as it would normally flow out and kind of flush back into this area. So over time, we can reinforce it filling on a regular basis. That's about the length of the berm. We have what's called a Geo Tube Berm or other rock dams that we could put across that at Montague Island that's at the northern tip of Sea of Cortez. So a technology approach, this again goes back to that very expensive construction methodology of building very expensive rock dams. We think that a floating barge system can excavate and widen the Coyote Canal, but can also be a conveyance system to create a new canal down to the Salton Sea. So these are about $750,000 or so to purchase, but you can widen deep in the Coyote Canal and you can create a system that does it very cost effectively. And you can create situations like this where it's not just a single line that crosses the desert, but it could become widened in areas that you want to do recreation. And over time, the water that flows in will create natural erosion that can create systems like this. Once you take a barge through it one pass, they'll naturally widen and deepen on their own. So this is phase 2. Once we get water to flood in there, basically what we want to do is create a system that's a livable sea. So if we just flooded that area, you would have over time a Dead Sea situation or a Salton Sea situation where salt just keeps accumulating. So the effect and the intent is that if we're going to deliver high quality ocean water to the Salton Sea, because there's a salt issue, you're going to want to bring water back around. Lots of other reasons that you want to have a livable sea is that you can have fisheries, you can have recreation, you can have aquaculture and all of those other amenities, but it would require bringing water back out and around. And the system that we would use, since this is all at sea level, is basically a lazy river where you have a pump that takes water back around in a series. You'd have a series of probably 6 of those large scale pumps like they have in the All-American Canal that moves water. So this is just a very interesting slide when we go back to that systems approach of seawater farming. So you have an opportunity, or just seawater landscapes and habitat. You have an area around Laguna Salada that becomes our green zone, right? This area in and of itself is a massive acreage that could further add water to the Colorado River Delta through evaporation. And it's a business opportunity for Mexico. They can deploy these type of seawater farms or seawater landscapes anywhere around the coast of Mexico to basically have energy independence by growing food and biofuel. North Lake structures, please, sir.
Yeah, would the eventual elevation of the surface level of Laguna Salada be like right at sea level or just a couple feet down?
It is at sea level right now, the historic shoreline of it.
Right, but when you fill it up, is it going to be like just below sea level or right at sea level?
It would probably be just a little bit below, a few feet below, because that flooding water that comes in due to evaporation, it loses about 8 feet a year to evaporation. So there's a heavy evaporation, so you'd always kind of be working against that battle, little bits at a time, right? But yeah, that's a great question. So this is kind of the North Lake that they proposed, which is in this blue line, and then they proposed this red area to go and grab water from here. But in our studies, there's a lot more evaporation by coming down and trying to grab that little water that comes through there that makes that whole red area cost prohibitive, not only from the structural system, but loss in evaporation. Why go down and do the extra mile? So we again propose to do a berming system that's a lot cheaper. The floating barge can come around and dredge this for $40 million instead of $400 million. So our proposal to the state is, why not be efficient with your funds, be able to have a dredging system. If there's an earthquake event and you have a rupture to the system, you bring your barge back around and fix it with sand that's locally sourced from the sediment down below. Opportunities for recreation and habitat with newly constructed wetlands and islands becomes a way that you, again, use those dredges. Just a fun way to kind of imagine the new habitat that you create to use those species that can sequester a lot of those heavy metals. And then the North Lake alternative and islands becomes a $40 million benefit to the $400 million alternative. And it has a lot more habitat. Everywhere along that berm, we would plant our species to uptake some of those heavy metals. So, interesting. I did not want to go this route, but I have an engineer and I trust engineers to know science and I trust them to know what needs to be applied. And looking at the numbers, the amount of evaporation in the Salton Sea is about 1.2 million acre feet a year. So 1.2 million acre feet is a massive quantity of water going into the atmosphere. With the amount of water that's being lost from the QSA of 400,000 acre feet, the only alternative that you have is to put salty water into an enclosed area. And so we propose to create certain enclosures, or we'll call them salt sinks, where you could put salty water into them and let the natural occurring fresh water refill the main body of water. So this is something I was resistant to, but I trust people that know science to know we need to put that salt water somewhere, and this might be a way to achieve that. And those berm systems are a lot more cost effective because you can use natural sediment, you pump it into a big pile, now you have a berm system that's pretty fluid. And you have opportunities for recreation on both sides of it. So I kind of created this, again, that barge that you saw in down here in Cesar Chavez Park, if they ever let me install it, would be the same opportunity for education and recreation within the Salton Sea. And it's mobile, so you can move it around. My hope in the long term is that we have one of these in Mission Bay, we have one of these in San Diego Bay, we have one in San Francisco Bay, where you have a hub of technology that has these floating islands and different technology to share with youth, because they're very interested in science and technology, and it can be fun too and include recreation. So you can see another salt sink up here to the left side, and that would basically sequester all the salt and all the agrochemicals for the next 1,000 years. So you'd have a viable Salton Sea where you can have boat recreation in the middle. You can have it all the way around that periphery, which is capturing all that freshwater inflow. The interesting part about my thoughts in large infrastructure projects like this are all of the additional renewable energy opportunities. So if anybody's familiar with pump hydroelectric storage, you have opportunities in 5 or 6 locations where you're using solar energy or wind energy to pump water to a high point. And when you have the grid go down or you're working at night, you let water flow down to create energy. So it's one of those balancing mechanisms that the country needs to transition to its renewable energy goals. And we have about 6 locations around Laguna Salada and the Salton Sea. This one happens to be, if you remember the Desert Shores project, that is up there, that's up there to the north. That's the Desert Shores Keys. That green area is the North Lake. Then you have a red line, which is a pipe that brings water to the top of the mountain range. So there's all these add-ons that happen at a later date once you build the infrastructure. Those little red lines and circles are pump hydroelectric storage opportunities. Then you have an operational system. And hopefully at the end of the day, you have a beautiful restored Laguna Salada and the Salton Sea. And again, I'll link this. Let's see if it does play. Maybe not. I had my sound and everything. No, it didn't play. I'll share those with you guys later, but global expansion. So this is a very interesting opportunity to use that template, and that's the whole purpose of this discussion, is to take this regional binational restoration project and see where there's areas that you can expand it to a global scale. The logic behind that is we see with current trends that there's going to be a lot of extra seawater with sea level rise and glaciers melting, that we're going to have to do something with that ocean water. So projects like this are a viable opportunity to bring them into inland seas. Egypt, the Qattara Depression, if we're expanding to that global scale. This one, and I use these diagrams, but this one isn't the most ideal for that main proposal of transferring water to another area. This one happens to have the wind flow that blows in this direction, so you don't have that occurrence where you have large mountain ranges that will create the effect of clouds hitting the mountains and dropping water down. This one just happens to have a renewable energy benefit and that seawater landscape agriculture opportunity in the middle of the desert. So bringing in water, you can create a lot of renewable energy with hydroelectric generation, but a lot of jobs and a microclimate with flooding that area and then having arterial uses of seawater landscapes around there. This one is almost identical to Laguna Salada, and this is kind of the end of our presentation, but the reason I bring up the Danakil Depression is that you have a dry basin, one of the hottest places on Earth. You have Saudi Arabia to the east. You have that whole continent. And then you have Djibouti down here to the south, and you have Eritrea to the north. The seawater farm operation that they had running was actually in Eritrea before it transitioned into a dictatorship. So that project wasn't able to move forward. They had constructed a large seawater farm that demonstrated the biofuel and the food production. This happens to be an area where it would have that evaporation and conveyance system that would drop a lot of evaporated water into the central part of Africa to create that green wall, which people are proposing. You're dropping a lot of water into the central areas of Africa that can kind of reduce desertification. The scale of this is about 10 times larger than Laguna Salada, but that's why we need a project on the ground that's very easy, that's a template for replicating. So those are some of our partners, right? Lucid Energy, Floating Islands, Intrinsic, PPCU. Yeah, kind of as a summary in this proposal, because I want to make sure that we have enough time to get questions and answers. The most important part of what we're trying to do and the goal for our efforts is to build partners and volunteer campaign, provide information to the public, information to government, fundraising efforts, seed capital, and build like micro education centers. Once we get those micro education centers and small scale residential projects like Desert Shores and Salton City Keys, then we can really start to market and share this larger regional effort. But this is really the scale at which we need to act over the next 40 years. We need to have this built in 10 years, and then we need to build 10 more of these in 10 years, and 50 more of these in the next 10 years. If you build projects at this scale, you can actually reduce that carbon emissions sink, put it all back into the ground, create the biofuel production and the food production that takes a lot of our very intense food operations and fuel operations into a habitat. It's really creating an environment that has new opportunities for new species, more mangrove forests that sequester much more carbon. So that scale of thinking can get this emergency that we have on our hands under control very quickly. And looking at this scale, this ends up being, and I talked a lot with Micah about this in our podcast, we'll share that on our YouTube channel too if anybody's interested, but not doing anything is about a $77 billion impact, from real estate to health to tourism, Coachella, Stagecoach, PGA golf tournaments that happen in the desert. Those no longer are as viable because you have a health, life, safety issue when you're breathing in toxic chemicals in the dust. So that's the scale at which inaction has an effect. This proposed project is in the range of $1.5 to $2 billion. About half of that can create the entire flooded and restored Laguna Salada of around $675 million, can create a whole new lake almost the size of the Salton Sea, built probably within that 5 or 10 year period. The total construction cost, 1.5 to 2 billion, is a large number, but that's about half the cost of all the alternative projects that are in review with the state, and you get double the benefit, right? You get a restored Laguna Salada and restored Salton Sea, and all the rest of the projects just look at a restored Salton Sea. So moving forward, my goal, to get back to our summary, is we're gonna be doing a global climate model. It's about $100,000 to study what a dried Salton Sea looks like as it relates to the Colorado River Delta system, what a fully restored Salton Sea looks like as it relates to that multi-state infrastructure system, what a flooded Laguna Salada and flooded Salton Sea looks like, and then maybe those seawater farms that happen around that to see how that might affect the Colorado River Delta. Maybe we can create a surplus of 2 million or 3 million acre feet a year, and a lot of that water can flow back down into this delta and go to Mexico. We can do more water transfers, we can have more water, reducing the very drastic effects of our fire season here in California, as well as many other states. So that's the goal. It's ambitious, but it's attainable. So I guess with that, do we have any questions that we want to get started with? I'm sorry it's so much information. right? I've been talking for 45 minutes straight.
Water surplus, how do you end up with a, I mean, freshwater surplus?
Mm-hmm.
How do you end up with a freshwater surplus?
Well, that's the point of what we were trying to talk about when we introduced this, which is the water cycle. So anytime you have a flooded area such as Laguna Salada or the Salton Sea, what happens, and I apologize for not going into more detail. Yep, evapotranspiration. So what you have, the natural monsoons, they're using water that evaporates here from the northern tip of the Sea of Cortez. When it's at a certain peak temperature, around 32 degrees Celsius, I believe, that's what triggers the monsoons to occur. All the clouds go up, it takes all that water into the clouds, and it starts driving itself forward. When it hits the mountains, the Colorado River Mountains, or the Colorado Rockies, all of it hits and starts dropping. On the way to those Rockies, it also drops in New Mexico and Arizona. So how can we magnify that, and how can we quantify that that is actually occurring? And then our hope is you're dropping water anywhere in between. So all of those little tiny plants that grow out in the middle of the desert, that's a carbon sink, right? If you can quantify that on a state size scale, how much carbon sequestration you're doing, you can monetize it and you can market that as a viable project. Yeah. And so another quick thing, what we're trying to work with right now is NADBank to look for funding for cross-border restoration efforts that have a positive benefit in the United States. Also trying to discuss this with the International Water and Boundary Commission, which deals with binational projects that cross the border. Our hope, though, is that we can have this be a Mexico first type of project and stay within the confines of Laguna Salada to expedite the development of that while we're working on those much more intense cross-border water transfer permits. Please, yeah.
Yeah. Has anybody ever come up with a number from a percentage point of view, like how much the Sea of Cortez contributes to the monsoonal flow comparatively to like how much percentage it would possibly be increased with Laguna Salada?
We've just done rough estimations. So we don't know. We know that in Laguna Salada, it's about 3/4 of the size of the Salton Sea, but has almost equal the amount of evaporation. So in the Salton Sea, it's about 1.2 million acre feet per year. Down in Laguna Salada, even it being 3/4 the size, we anticipate the same, about 1.2 to 1.3 million acre feet a year. So we anticipate.
Compared to the Sea of Cortez, like how much does that contribute to the monsoon, percentage-wise, compared to how much it would be an additional monsoonal effect if the Laguna Salada was full?
Well, and a lot of that's going to be answered with our global climate model.
Okay.
We can only do assumptions. No, but you bring up a very, very good point in why we're proposing this project. So everybody has seen a water heater for a pool on the top of your house. The science behind what we're trying to do here is that you're going to have this large solar water heater that is Laguna Salada, and that water that comes back around into the Sea of Cortez, we think will lengthen and reinforce those monsoonal events by being and creating or stabilizing it at around that 33-degree margin, where sometimes once a year for 2 or 3 weeks you have monsoonal events. We hope that on a more regular basis that we can create water that flows down here that's heating it up just a little bit to not have a negative effect on the environment, but just enough to sustain that monsoonal event. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, so what if,
Hypothetically.
I'm pretty sure that what I heard you say was that you're gonna try to increase the temperature in the northern tip of the Sea of Cortez?
By a half a degree,
Just
a quarter of a
tiny,
degree.
tiny bit.
Right.
Yeah, because I mean, they have that endangered dolphin there and all that.
Exactly.
I can imagine them saying, okay.
No, and the vaquita is the dolphin species that is very endangered. That is our primary objective. We're opening up discussions with the Sonoran Institute, who is in charge, I wouldn't say in charge, but the majority of their work is in this biosphere. So we've had 3 discussions with them so far. We're hoping to have a more formal presentation to them and have them be a partner on this effort. That is our main objective, is to have 100% environmental benefit with 0% environmental impact. We actually want 150% environmental benefit or 300%, but that is our primary objective.
So from their point of view right now, they're on board with the idea that a slight increase in temperature is not going to have any.
I wouldn't say anybody's on board. It's an open discussion.
Okay.
We're trying to educate, we're trying to work with them, we're trying to have them collaborate with us, and with that climate model, that would include some of these type of studies where how much water, what level of temperature increase, what effect would that have? My main thought is that we would want a breeding program for the vaquita in here, where we, and I know this is a topic that has been discussed, they had a very difficult time trying a breeding program because they're very, I guess, sensitive species to capture, but there's very interesting things that were happening with, what do they call that, where you make another lamb? What is it? Cloning, yeah. There was a very interesting thing that they happened with a lamb where they did a cloning exercise with blood samples in an artificial womb. So I can imagine, since it is such a sensitive thing to capture these type of animals, that there might be blood sample species that we can utilize for a breeding program, so there's not an adverse effect. That's a little far-fetched, that's an add-on, but that's part of the benefit. Please, yeah, Mike.
Have you done any estimates around how many jobs would be created at different levels of the project? You know, temporary jobs, permanent jobs?
No, but massive. I mean, so like if we look at the scale of just a small portion of, you know, a pilot project down here at Campo Ramona, we're looking at a permit lease for about 50 acres. Within that 50 acres, you create 50 jobs, right? You have visitor center, you have a youth program, you have an education component. When you do that, 50 jobs, you have one per acre, you're looking at 600 million, you know, the scale of which the Salton or the Laguna Salada is 250,000 acres. So with that, if you have a job per acre of balancing habitat or a fish breeding program, Laguna Salada of water body, 250,000 jobs. If you do the acreage around it, you're magnifying it by a factor of 4. If you do that around the Salton Sea, so the scale of which has long-lasting effects and can be scaled on top of each other, where you have manufacturing happening, you have, you know, farming happening, and those are all in a cluster. So, sure.
Sort of two questions. Current climate models that I'm aware of suggest that we've got major droughts coming in the Southwest. What impact are these droughts for the next half century and beyond likely to have on the project? And second, does the project impact the water flow in the Colorado River?
Those are two great questions. The first part is, in a drought situation, you're going to have more evaporation. So that's actually going to have a positive effect on evaporation happening in the Colorado River Delta system because it's going to be hotter. More water goes into the cloud system, more water goes in. You have hotter events that are happening here, so it's more monsoonal events. So we hope as things move forward, that has a positive benefit on this project specifically. The effect on the Colorado River Delta system is refilling dams that are right now dry. So our hope is that when you get to that scale, if our hypothesis proves valid, that you can reflood a lot of these ponds and streams and areas that are going dry. Did that fully answer your question, or did you have any?
No, that's okay. One tangential question. You talked at the beginning about solar on top of water being a positive. Why don't we put massive solar farms in the ocean off of Belmar, La Jolla, Oceanside?
I mean, we're in La Jolla. You propose that, you're about to get beaten out of town, right? So no, I exactly agree with the logic that you're thinking, strategically though, right? So in areas where it makes sense, that is absolutely what we need to do. And if you've ever followed some of the articles about Elon Musk, his thought, because he owns a solar company, is if you cover a small area of Nevada, we could power the entire country on renewable energies with a small area of Nevada being solar panels. So to your logic, that makes absolute sense. where we could not have to do it on our houses. I just got solar on my house. I'm very excited, by the way. Took a long time in permitting, even though I worked at the permit office. But some people want to do it on their houses. Some commercial businesses want to do it. Some don't. Exactly what you're saying. The national, federal level should be going in that direction. And we hope with a new administration or just new blood, like Micah here, in the political network, that would move forward with alternative subsidies, not going to fossil fuels, instead going to renewables. Does that make sense? Our hope, I mean, like, we should all be lobbying the city of San Diego to put it over Lake Hodges or some of our reservoirs to reduce some of our water evaporation.
There's an awfully big ocean right out here.
There is a big ocean. Well, there's a big ocean in the Salton Sea and Laguna Salada too. So hydro, to our first point, there's a lot of opportunities for smaller hydroelectric generation. Down at the Salton Sea, because it's a negative 235, we can generate about 18 to 32 megawatts of just water flowing down, just with the very small infrastructural pipeline or open river. You put it into a pipeline at the very last 100 feet where it drops the most, then you're creating a lot of renewable energy. Yeah, sir?
You mentioned something about using global circulation models to test some of this. This is such a small area. Don't they run regional models to?
They do, but it doesn't have a lot of this input data that we would need. So it does of current occurring systems, but it doesn't on future proposed systems. So right now that model would show the Salton Sea being at its current level, but it wouldn't show it at 75% evaporation level. That's what we would want to show, because that's what the perimeter lake would show. And that's what keeping it full would show, flooding Laguna Salada, additional aquaculture would show. Does that kind of make sense? I mean, so the reason we would have to pay for it is because the studies that are done, they usually do them for what is happening right now as reporting data to the National Weather Service. They don't do it as schematic ideas for how you would affect that weather system. So we're working with the Desert Research Institute. Yeah, Desert Research Institute. They would propose to do that modeling for about $100,000. And that would be our goal, to ask the state of California to do that model for their preferred alternative perimeter lake and a full sea, and hopefully some of these other alternatives. Sir?
So, two questions. Who originally commissioned the Coyote Canal, and how long did that take?
That was the federal government of Mexico.
Well, do you know how long it took them to complete that?
I don't.
And then, how would the California government agency raise money for their alternate plan? Is it bonds or?
Yeah, that's currently what's, Governor Newsom, if people are familiar, he's trying to make the Salton Sea a top priority, restoration, getting projects on the ground. They're doing bonds, they're allocating funds that way. They have about 800 million or something allocated, but it's to already adopted projects that are on the ground for habitat, species conservation. They have 2 or 3 that are about $440 million that have been in the permitting process for about 10 years. But yes, that would be their logic of moving forward. They don't even have on their radar seawater import. That's their after 10-year plan, or an alternative 10-year plan. So the state is looking at maybe 20 years from now or 30 years from now, maybe implementing this. The logic that Aegis is taking is that we're going to build this one way or another, hopefully, with our partnerships and coordination opportunities with our friends in Mexico, that we could get at least phase 1 and 2 up and operational within a 5 to 10 year time frame. And then hopefully bring water within 7 miles of the US-Mexico border. Then it's an easy challenge to reimburse those funds, or to bring the water down and have that funded by state or federal governments. A couple more questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, you had some scenarios up earlier with some graphs and stuff. Some of them had the Salton Sea more full, some of them had less full.
Yeah.
I guess I might be the only one here, but I'm still not 100% sure like what you're advocating as to whether or not you're going to try to restore the Salton Sea to levels 20 years ago? Or are you going ahead with the idea that it's gonna be lower and you're doing the North Lake and the South Lake? Or is that the state and you guys are different, or are you guys?
Well, we're proposing information to the state. You can go with a perimeter lake and a North Lake and all these alternatives, but they're very expensive. Our proposal is to build dirt berms with the floating barges. And the reason being is that you would still need water on both sides of that berm. So if we built, like you see in the northern tip here, if everybody can see, if you built those in-sea salt sinks, you would still need water flowing into them, but you can do them quickly, and you would have about 10 years until you have, subsidence happening on your dirt berm, at which point you could just add more dirt to it, make it wider, but you would still need ocean water to come in eventually. So the point to your question is we want to restore both. We want to bring the Salton Sea back to the historic level while addressing the salinity issue by balancing it with these salt sinks. So these structures.
Was at the level that, let's say it was back in 1960 or
Yeah.
You still want to make all these different salt sinks and stuff, even
You-
if it was back high.
You kind of need, so I didn't start with that, but the salt issue at the sea, it's at a tipping point right now. Tilapia is the last fish that's able to survive in the Salton Sea, and right now it's at that point where they can't breed anymore because it's too salty. They could still survive, but they can't breed to make new fish that sustain the habitat. So going forward, you need to stabilize the salt issues, and the salt sinks we anticipate is a way to do that. Over time, you could reduce this. You see a large area now. Over time, you could build a berm down the middle here and then just open up those other channels or completely erase them with a barge that's still cheaper than the perimeter lake. So the thought is being completely flexible to any scenario. We could build an alternative North Lake for 40 million where the state's going to spend 400. We could build the entire Salton Sea structures for 440 million as opposed to their 1.2 billion, right? So we're trying to provide them alternatives and different systems that can be cost benefit for the taxpayer and the environment. Our hope is that we're going to create a habitat that is at the historic level for many reasons. I brought about Desert Shores and Salton City. They have 240 property lots. The logic of flooding that with a berm and $200,000 of infrastructure can create $1,000 maybe of value. That pays for the cost of infrastructure. If it goes to $10,000, you've made 10 times the benefit to the cost of infrastructure implementation. Is that metric, right? Like $1,000 gets you the price that it costs. $10,000 gets you 10 times the cost of infrastructure. So at a Salton Sea scale, when we go to the $77 billion cost of inaction, it might be a net benefit of $77 billion over 10 years or more. So our hope is that it's a benefit for the economy and the ecology. And that's the reason why we want to take this to global scale, because that's the same logic that you would put on habitat restoration and fixing the climate crisis that we have. The cost of inaction is very expensive. The cost of full restoration, not so expensive in the scheme of things. Yeah, please.
A question related to the funding stream and how these things work together. You're mentioning that these lots, these private lots, I guess, where people are going to live there, they're owned by private companies or private individuals.
Individuals.
But you're kind of saying that somehow the money that they're going to realize is an appreciation for their property, I guess, somehow going to be reflected. So are they going to be charged?
No,
Or
basically.
how's that funding? I'm a little confused on that.
No, the logic is basically the county would be the beneficiary, the person that would install the infrastructure. When they have value that increases, then those tax bases increase. The county is the beneficiary. When they sell, when the individual landowner sells, then they benefit from those sales increased value. So really, the county is the one that's going to install the infrastructure. They're the one that's going to have the contract with the state. They're the one that's going to financially benefit to build more infrastructure and more dust mitigation is the hope.
Okay, so that funding would generally go to the county, which is Imperial County.
And the health, life, safety of the people that live in those houses.
Sure, oh, yeah, no, definitely. I see the benefit. I just wanted to get a little clarification on the funding.
And it's funny, the public or media, I wouldn't say media because I'm not known at all, but people antiquate it with me being a developer as I'm going to be the beneficiary. So I'm glad you asked that question. This is a project that I'm doing pro bono for the community. I've worked 3 years without an income stream, and our hope is that the community benefits, not our company. Obviously, we want to get projects on the ground, and we're more interested in the conduit between the state and local agencies, because you have 50 agencies all fighting for pennies, and they're not getting projects implemented. So we, as a professional project management company, can be the people that get projects on the ground quickly.
Without trying to pry or anything.
No, please.
So are you affiliated with another company, because somehow, you're getting funding, I'm not trying to
No, please.
tag you, I'm just curious. Is there another company somehow that's helping to foot the bill for whatever you're doing?
No, that's why I work my full-time job at the city, right? And I have my 3 kids, right? So,
Personally, extend yourself to do this?
my hope is that it will get done, and my goal is that I can transition into AGE's efforts full-time. I'm doing other industrial permitting and development. Me and Mike here, we're actually looking at my property to do some residential development. So I'm doing all of those projects on the side, but our hope is that this is my contribution as a for-profit company to something to get done. We're working with another nonprofit agency that owns the 2 lots, but I worked hand and foot to get the IID to sell that nonprofit those 2 lots, as our hope is to build that visitor center and that education center. But yeah, right now, for free.
But somehow there is a for-profit company in the works somehow?
That's my company, yeah. We're so good background, actually. Thank you for bringing that up. We're S Corp with a B designation. So our B designation allows us to contribute a certain amount of capital that we do collect to environmental restoration projects without board voting, although all of our board supports environmental restoration. But if we had a project like this come into our for-profit branch, we could allocate 10% of those profit revenues directly toward environmental restoration projects in addition to a project like this. But we are in the works setting up a branch that's not part of myself and our company, that would be a nonprofit group, so that they can work on grants, we could provide services. So I don't know how that works out. I'm working with legal counsel right now because I would have to be detached, or I'd have to leave my for-profit to some of our other board members to switch to that. So trying to keep a direct separation between those. Grants are very hard though. Has anybody gotten a grant here? Very hard. And I mean, from a policy perspective, we hope that in the future, grants aren't as difficult to come by, because getting a project on the ground and getting it implemented for the dollars to cents and the benefit to it, hopefully that process can be shortened or lessened. Any other questions? Good?
So.
I think that's our time, yeah?
Yes. Because we do just have a couple more minutes left before
Yeah.
the final notice comes out. I now notice that they closed down computers and such, that we have to return some things to them.
Yep.
So I just thought I would end by saying again, thank you, and then we can thank Nathan.
Appreciate it, yeah.
Mike Perlin is here. You can see his posters. I don't want to make a big announcement, but any interest, you can certainly approach him about what he's doing in his state assembly run. You can see one of his campaign platforms is Climate Action Now.
Mm-hmm.
So if I said that right, I'm on film here, so I have no attachment. But that was just, and so there's time to, certainly meet with Nathan and Mike out in the lobby.
Yep.
Collect some business cards, exchange some contact information.
Yep.
There we go.
The library will be closed
Perfect
in
timing.
15 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, by the way. Yeah. Appreciate your time, yeah.